Okay, hi. My name is Ken Chase, and I am a senior consultant here with Improving. Been working primarily in the endpoint device management space, probably around, close to 20 years or so. Working with SCCM MEM, as it's called today, as well as the entire System Center stack, and Azure, as well as monitoring and other features within the Azure service stack. So what we'll talk about today is really deploying devices with Windows Autopilot. It's not going to be super slide heavy because I want to spend some time kind of showing you where some of the things are and how to do some of the things that you would have to do to configure Autopilot. Would be located and what consoles you would have to go to for said settings. And also want to give you guys an opportunity to kind of just ask any questions or, answer some of my questions, and I think actually we'll start out with a question. So who's attending, who all that is currently attending the session here has actually looked at Autopilot, has considered using Autopilot, or knows anything about Windows Autopilot?
Well, I've looked at it, but I haven't used it yet, but I'm definitely considering it.
Okay. What are you currently doing today for your provisioning process?
Just straight up manual.
Okay.
Unbox it, set it up.
Okay, you guys are currently not using like SCCM or anything?
No, not currently.
Okay. All right. So we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. So that's a good thing. At least someone has actually been looking at it or thought about it. It is a rather slick and useful tool to use, especially if you're wanting to streamline your device deployment. Getting that device from an OEM directly to a user's hands and then having it more or less self-service, as opposed to having the device shipped to you and then you configuring it and then handing it off to a user. So it kind of cuts down on the time a little bit, or at least takes some of the administrative overhead off of your plate. In a way, it just shifts the administrative overhead to a more technical aspect of creating profiles and so on. So with that being said, let's kind of get straight into it. So, what is Autopilot? Windows Autopilot is just what it says here. It's a collection of tools within the Intune service or within Azure, and it allows you to set up and pre-configure devices. What it is not a replacement for a traditional OSD bare metal imaging solution. So anybody here on the call, if you're using SCCM today and you're thinking, oh, well, this is really cool, I can take Autopilot and just, throw SCCM out the window. Not really. There's a lot of functionality and features that you're not going to get with Autopilot today that are still present and available to you with SCCM. And it really boils down to the amount of flexibility you have with customizations with SCCM as opposed to what you have with Windows Autopilot. So, just keep that in mind. It's not it's not a one-to-one relationship or replacement for a bare metal imaging solution like SCCM. So kind of understand the process overview of how this works with Autopilot. You can manually put the devices into the enrollment profile and within Autopilot service within Intune. I wouldn't recommend that. That just adds additional overhead to yourself. You can have your OEM, though, do it for you. Most OEMs do it today for you. I think there is a small fee for it, but they are able to take that hardware identifier, the hardware hash, and inject that into your tenant or into your Autopilot service via a portal that they have, which you would grant them access to. So what happens is obviously you purchase the device from the vendor. The vendor then sends that device to a end user that you specify. And the end user will go ahead and most likely they'll go ahead, depending on the solution, if they're a straight Azure AD or a hybrid Azure AD join machine, they will put in their Azure UPN or their email address for the company. So usually your Azure UPN should be pretty close to what your email address is for your organization. And obviously the user's creds. Once they do that, the device is already being targeted from a profile, which we'll discuss a little bit, and I'll show you how you create a profile that says, you know, what you want that device to do. You know, do you want it to name the device? Do you want it to auto join the domain? Do you want to specify specific administrative users on it? Any customizations you may have for the device. So say you wanted the device as a Windows Pro, but you want it to be Windows Enterprise, you can change the licensing for it as well. And you can do that a couple different ways. You can go ahead and do the out-of-box experience, or you can basically do a white glove type scenario where there's not a whole lot going on from the end user. Once they put in their username and password, they step back and they wait until it tells them it's done. So that's your self-service experience. And then once it's done, it's straight to ready for business. Now, Autopilot does give you the ability, though, to also do some break fix / reset of a device. So if a device potentially is problematic, you can reset the device and reinitiate the Autopilot process. So reset that device to out-of-box experience. And start the whole process over again. So you can do that as well. So the process is pretty straightforward. Again, you would order the device from your vendor. The vendor would then put that device hardware ID within your Autopilot service, within your Intune or Azure tenant. And then the device would be shipped to the end user. And that end user then would go ahead and sign in with their email address or UPN and password, and then the provisioning would begin. Any questions so far?
Question I always get, Ken, and you may be covering this on future slides. What about your app stack, your core app stack, or even Office and things like that?
So how those are handled are two different ways. So say you're an SCCM shop today. You're currently using SCCM, and say you have a cloud management gateway. You could potentially still leverage SCCM for your application delivery by just installing the ConfigMan client on the device and allowing the device to either pull applications that are targeted to it either over the CMG or from VPN connectivity, whichever. Or you can go ahead and have those applications created and staged in Intune. And then those applications are then targeted obviously to a user profile as opposed to a device. So you, just like you're currently doing, if you guys are, anyone here is actually actively using Intune, you can deploy to devices or you can deploy to users. I am more of a deploy to user than a device. So that way, if a user gets a new device, they can get the applications they need. So that's pretty much it for your application stack. You can create it. You can get that from either Intune service or free SCCM, depending on how you want to do it. And there's multiple ways to actually do application deployments within Intune. There are other products that you can use to help to what the other third-party vendors say enhance Intune. I'm not a big fan of many of those. I would probably just stick with the straight Intune. You know, sometimes less is more. The more you pile onto the service, the more complex you're going to make it. And the harder it is, the more you're going to add to your administrative overhead. So, you know, keep it simple, if at all possible.
Thanks, Ken.
So, you know, what is it that you need to do? And this is kind of, you know, these are your requirements. Windows Autopilot, excuse me, applies to Windows 10 and holographic. Obviously, there's some caveats to that. Holographic has to be version 2004 or later. Windows 10 has specific supported versions. You can go semi-annual channel or enterprise 2019 LTSC. And it does support Pro for education and workstation, enterprise, education, enterprise. Notice there's no home user. So if you were to buy a home laptop from Dell and you bought your laptops and it was from the OEM and it was Windows 10 home, part of the thing is your Intune or your Autopilot config would be to be changing that license from a home license to a Pro license or whatever licensing model you're going to follow. You do have to have Azure AD. Okay, I believe it's a P1 license is the minimum. And you can be using hybrid Azure AD join. There used to be some caveats with the hybrid Azure AD join. You kind of had to do an offline domain join. And then the machine would have to either be connected to VPN or somehow connected to your actual corporate network to then actually join the domain. They've kind of gotten around that. They've made some enhancements. The importance on that is that you have to use a valid UPN or email address that is synced with the Azure AD service for the user to sign in. You cannot use a pre-Win 2000. So you can't do a domain / It has to be a valid UPN and or email address. So what I kind of always say is email address, because some users, if you tell them, hey, you need to put your UPN in, they have no idea what you're talking about. Now, if you tell them, hey, put in your email address, they know what that is. So as long as they put in their email address and their actual domain creds, they should be able to enroll the device and join the domain.
Sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
Are you going to be show an example of the domain join today when doing Autopilot?
We are not going through an actual demo of the Autopilot provisioning process, but I am going to go through setting up some of the different items for you. Okay. Reason being, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, when I was testing it, and when I was testing it was in December of last year, that was one of the issues I had with the domain join after assigning it to the Intune environment. And I was hoping to see a little bit of an example towards the improvement that they made towards it. But I'm like, I can just go with the examples you're going to show. So thank you.
Yeah, actually of December last year is that problem that I was talking about where you could not do the hybrid Azure AD. If you had a hybrid Azure AD environment, the device had to be either connected VPN or connected to actually the network. Otherwise, what you would have to do is an offline domain join.
Yep. That's what happened.
Josh, if you're interested, we can always reach out to you offline.
That'd be perfect.
Okay.
So
thank you.
No problem. So obviously the devices have to be enrolled to the Windows Autopilot service. And as I talked about earlier, that can be accomplished via the EPM or OEM, or you can do it manually.
You got a purse.
Mm-hmm.
It's heavy.
I put a lot of stuff in it. It was my phone and my wallet and a pen and pads and not even my keys yet.
I think Ken Matthew, you've got your.
I just didn't want a big stack.
Go on mute. There we go. Okay.
So, and also there is a link within this presentation that really talks about the Autopilot licensing, and I can put this in the actual chat here in a moment for you, or if Chris or someone could do that, that would be great. So I can keep moving along. So, obviously these are all your licensing requirements. There's quite a bit, you have to have, again, like I said, you have to have an Intune subscription, and you have to have an Azure Active Directory P1 or P2. Obviously, then you have to go into the separate licensing models that you have for the M365 stack, if you will. So whether it's business, F1, F3, A, academic, enterprise, E3, E5s, or EMS, E3, E5, you do have to have something, one of those subscriptions. Otherwise, you're kind of in a situation where you're going to get a half-baked solution. You're not going to be able to fully utilize this process. So if you have an AAD, P1, P2, and a Microsoft Intune subscription, but you don't have the valid licensing for the products, it's not really going to do you much good. And let me get back down here. So this is where we're going to kind of go in and go through your walkthroughs. So again, I'm not going to cover, there's not a whole lot I can really cover as far as a demo goes, like showing you the actual provisioning process, primarily because my lab environments took a nosedive on me last night, and I didn't have time to rebuild it. So we're kind of like, I'm stuck with a situation where I can go through the console, show you the different areas where you have to set things up at, and answer any questions you guys might have. So let me we'll go through my test tenant or my lab tenant. So obviously one of the big things is in my environment, I have hybrid Azure AD join configured. So I have hybrid Azure AAD. One of the items is you used to, and I'm having trouble finding it now. One of the things that's important to know is for your device naming. It used to be under the devices blade is where you actually specify the naming sequence. And for some reason, it is not here anymore. So I'm going to have to find that and send that out to you. But what you would do here is you would basically specify what the naming standard is for your device. One of the things to keep in mind is if you're a config man shop, or even if you're a not config man shop, you're just used to deploying your devices by hand. The auto naming is limited to a prefix, and then it's a series of random numbers afterwards. So your prefix would be, in some cases, your company name. So say in this case, my test environment is X-Force Corp. So mine would be X-Force and then whatever series of numbers that Azure AD decides it's going to throw against it. But you would then configure that, and I have to find where that's at. Again, like I said, they moved it, and I have to now find where they moved it to. Unfortunately, it's part of the name of the game with Azure is they're constantly making changes, and as they constantly make changes, sometimes things that you should be where they were are no longer where they were. So let's talk about actual Autopilot. Autopilot, everything for Autopilot is, other than the naming standard that you configure, is done within the endpoint console. So the Intune console, what used to be the Intune console. It is now the Microsoft Endpoint Manager Admin Center. And you would do it from the devices blade and enroll devices. And obviously here you have your Windows Autopilot deployment program. And you have to have your Intune connector for Azure Active Directory configured. And this is basically your hybrid Azure AD join connector. And mine is broken, so we'll just ignore that. Pay no attention to the man behind the mirror, because I'll have to fix that one, or behind the curtain, that is. So from enroll devices, again, we talked about your device hardware hashes. This is where you would find those at. So when your OEM uploads those device hashes, they will be here. question, the gentleman that said he had a problem with the domain join, were your hardware
Yes.
identifiers populated here?
Yes, I
Okay.
actually imported them manually.
Okay.
So instead of having the OEM do it.
Yeah, so I have seen in cases where people say that their domain join failed. And the reason it'll fail is if there is no hardware identifier associated. You can start the autopilot provisioning, but once it checks against the autopilot devices, it'll bomb out and it won't allow it to enroll. It won't allow it to join the domain. So that's one thing to kind of look at. So if you ever have a situation again like this, one of the things I would look at is make sure that your hardware identifier is actually present here in your autopilot devices.
Okay.
So once you have these devices populated, the next step, or the first step, depending on how you're doing this, if you're just starting down the process and you're going to have the OEM put your devices in here, would be to do your deployment profiles. So a deployment profile, I have one here. Very basic. Obviously, you specify a name, and I can go through and show this to you here. Let's go ahead and create a profile. So obviously, in this scenario, I don't want to convert. So you can convert all your devices to a autopilot. But again, like it says here, the next time the registered device goes through Windows out-of-box experience, they will go through the assigned autopilot scenario. So if for some strange reason a user resets their device to out-of-box, it's going to go through the autopilot scenario. That may not be a big problem, but I kind of like to avoid that if I can. I kind of want to have more understanding of what's happening in my environment. If I flip it to everything, I'm a little squirrelish about that, if you will. So I kind of stay away from that. Obviously, we go through that. So you can configure your out-of-box experience, user-driven. There's a new one for self-deploying. Self-deploying is kind of nice. This one to me is more useful in the case of, say, you're going to be deploying kiosks. So if you're going to be doing any kiosk machines, so you order a machine from Dell's, your OEM, say, and you want to create a kiosk profile, so it's going to be self-deploying. There's nothing that anybody has to do other than fire that baby up and let it go. That's a good one to use. Otherwise, user-driven is probably the best way to go. So if it's going to a user, I would say choose user-driven. If it's not going to be specifically assigned to a specific user, do a self-deploying, because it's going to assign the profile and it does not care if there's a user going to be signed on to it or not. It's just going to configure it how you want it configured, period. So then you can choose whether or not you're going to do hybrid Azure AD joined. So you can skip the AD connectivity check. Now in preview, that is basically more or less doing an offline domain join. Okay, so this is more or less going to say, I'm not going to check and see if I can connect to the DC. I'm just going to go ahead and go through my process. And if I can't, then I'll do an offline, and next time I connect to the network, I will join to the domain. Does that make sense? All right. You can choose whether or not you're going to hide or show the software licensing terms. In that case, privacy settings, you can choose to show or hide those as well. Again, if you're wanting to have a streamlined solution, I would say hide as much as you can. That way your user's not going to be bogged down with seeing things that they don't really necessarily have to care about. The changing account options, I tend to hide this. Again, this is because we don't want to, I don't really want the user to make any changes to their account settings. I just want them to sign in using their email address and their password and let the device do what it has to do. Here you can specify whether the user is going to be an administrator or a standard user. Depending on your security within your organization is dependent upon what you're going to choose. I would highly discourage you from setting all your users to administrator, but again, depends on your company and how you guys are staffed. Many companies have all their users as administrators because they're not staffed appropriately to handle the flood of service desk calls they may get. For simple things like, I need application X installed on my machine. Can you help me? So they'll grant everybody administrator just so they can install everything they need to install. White glove is basically, if they hit F5, it's going to run without authentication. So it's just going to go ahead and provision a device, and it's going to enroll the device, and it's going to just do what it needs to do. So in a scenario where you don't even want them to authenticate, you just want the device to register and enroll, you would choose white glove. And in that case, they'd hit the window key 5 times and it would just go through its process. So if you wanted to tell the users, when you receive your machine powered on, hit the Windows key 5 times, it's going to go through the entire process without them authenticating. So what's going to happen is nothing that's user specific. So any applications or things like that, they're not going to load to the machine until that user finally signs on, because your applications, if you're deploying them via Intune, are going to be targeted to the user. So once that user logs on, that's when it'll start getting what it needs to get as far as applications go. Unless, of course, you target the applications to the device. Then they'll get the applications. Obviously, you select your operating system regions. Automatically configure keyboard, obviously based off of region. And this is where I was talking about apply your device name template. So if you had your device name template, you would have to specify that under the domain join configuration within Azure AD. Again, I have to find where that's at. It's been moved on me. Once you've done all that, this is where you're going to go ahead and you're going to add this profile to either groups or all devices. Obviously, you're going to choose groups in this scenario, and you would specify whatever AD group you may have, or Azure AD group that you may have that is holding devices that you want to apply that specific profile to. So in some cases, maybe you have a Autopilot profile that's targeted to, say, executives, and that is always going to be a white glove. And maybe they're always going to be administrators. So then you would have a Azure AD group for executive devices that would be populated with all the hardware IDs for those devices. And at that point, you could go through and just assign based off of that, those machines. Obviously, you can also exclude groups. So if I were to say I want to add groups, so I want to make sure that, say you have nested groups, for example. So say I have my C-level group is a member of a group, but I also have a IT administrators group as a member of the same group. Maybe I want this to apply to the C-level, but I don't want to apply to the IT administrators. In this case, what you could do is you could add the parent group and exclude the nested group. Overcomplicated. I would just stick with having groups that are specifically targeted to the type of deployment or profile that you're going to be going with. Obviously, once you're done with that, you would just choose next, and here's where you can review all your settings. Very simple. I am not going to save that. Now, once you've done that, obviously you've assigned it to a profile or to a device. What should be happening at that point is when the user goes ahead and they get their laptop and they fire it up for the first time, depending on whether you said to go ahead and hit that Windows key 5 times or not, is dependent upon what experience they're going to have. If they hit the Windows key 5 times, they're not prompted with anything. It just begins provisioning. If you want them to authenticate against the device, to register it and whatnot, they're going to be presented with a logon screen. When they get that logon screen, they put in their username, which is their email address and their corporate password, and they allow the device to go through the provisioning process. Again, take in mind, and I'm going to kind of keep repeating this, this is not a bare metal solution. This is leveraging the OS that is already on a device when you order it from an OEM. So that is how we're able to streamline this process, because at that point, all you're doing is you're customizing the device with an autopilot provisioning profile that says join it to the domain. And then you're configuring the device, by using Intune policies. So you're configuring the device by doing a configuration policy. You're configuring the device by doing setting other things on it, such as like BitLocker policies. So this is where you're getting all the customizations you need to do. So if you need to configure disk encryption, if you need to configure antivirus, endpoint protection, firewall settings, any of that stuff, account protection, device compliance, so on and so forth. That's all done from within Intune, and it's targeting either a user or a group of devices. So keep that in mind. You can target these endpoint security policies to either a user or a device. What you're also going to be getting is, at this point, is your applications. So this is where you'll go ahead and you'll configure what applications go to a user. So in my case, the only one I have right now on my lab is my config manager client setup. But obviously, you can add anything from the Microsoft Store, Windows 10, 365 apps, Microsoft Edge, web links, Windows apps, Win32. Question: does anyone have experience with Intune and applications?
I do.
Okay. And have you worked any with the creating Win32 apps, converting XE apps into Intune applications?
I did. I was able to deploy one of our in-house, not an in-house application, but a business application through the autopilot deployment.
Mm-hmm.
Once I imported it directly into Intune, I wasn't able to push the configurations needed for the profile. I had to make another PowerShell script for that,
Mm-hmm.
but it was still a problematic because, even though I was able to deploy the out-of-box experience, the application, Office suite, I couldn't get it to join the domain.
Yeah.
So that was one of the biggest issues that I came across with it.
Yeah. So, but at least it's good to hear that you have some experience with at least deploying applications and that, so you understand the concepts that I'm kind of talking about.
Yes.
Like Rick said, though, if you want, we can reach out to you, or Chris can go ahead and Chris, could you make sure you captured this gentleman's name, and we can reach back out to him and maybe offer him some assistance with talking about that a little bit.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so this stuff right here is where you're going to configure all your applications. Your devices, obviously, like I said, you have your compliance policies, your configuration profiles. So configuration profiles, notice here I have a domain join profile. And this is just basically saying where to put my devices. So if you were to look at this, oh, here we go. Computer name prefix. So I'm specifying it here, my domain name, and my organizational unit. So you'll configure that, and it'll say this is what I want to start with. This is the domain I want it to join, and this is the organizational unit I want it to put it in. There are other ones in here. Let me go back. So obviously I have one thing to talk about here too, as well as, and this is a strange topic, autopilot, because it bleeds into so many different pieces into Intune. The autopilot piece itself is pretty simple, other than you might run into a domain join issue. It's all the other stuff that bolts on top of the autopilot to finish that actual provisioning that is like the meat and potatoes in my mind, because you could easily just send a device to a user and say, hey, go ahead and do out of box to it, and here's how you join it to the domain. Go ahead and go to settings, go to domain, blah, 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 click join work domain and put in your credentials. I mean, that's all they would have to do, technically. But it wouldn't be a corporate device really then at that point. At that point, it's kind of like you're telling a user, take your home PC and go to settings and domain join and join the machine to the domain, to our corporate domain, by putting in your email address and your password. The autopilot process gives them that standard Windows corporate logon experience. They're going to have to put in their email address or their UPN and their password to get into the machine. So, you have your device configs. This one here is just an example of what I was playing around with. So what I would like to say on this is kind of a not a 100% one-to-one relationship for group policy, but it's pretty darn close. So any settings that you would configure through a group policy, you can configure within here. How you would do that is you would go ahead and say, I'm going to select my Windows 10 or later, and to go ahead and get that group policy like one-to-one type settings, choose settings catalog, assign it a name, click add settings, and if you look here, you've got just about everything that you would have normally in group policy. So a lot of this stuff that's in group policy today is in the settings catalog.
And isn't it kind of important because group policy is going away?
Yes and no. As long as there's going to be a on-premise environment, Microsoft's been saying group policy is going away for a long time. If group policy truly was going away, they wouldn't be having a settings catalog within Intune in Azure. They've tried to go the route of DSC, desired state configuration. They've also tried to go the route of configuration baselines within SCCM. Both of those tool sets, I think, are amazing, and I think they're actually better and more reliable than group policy. Unfortunately, most IT staff and engineers and administrators are so used to group policy, and they've understood it and used it for so long that it's not something that's easily dying off. So I think that's why you're seeing the settings catalog within Intune, to allow an administrator to still have that same functionality and feel the group policy gives them, because otherwise all these settings that you're wanting to set, so say like these power throttling settings, or let's go notification settings. How about that? All these notification settings in here, you would have to create PowerShell scripts to do all this. And that's how you would control these things previously, is you would create a device config that applied a PowerShell script that would flip the bits within the registry for these devices, for any of these settings. So, you know, to kind of get away from that pain of having to script all these things, Microsoft realized that these are very important settings that need to be easily accessible to administrators, because not everyone is going to be a PowerShell guru. And you've got to make things somewhat simpler for, you know, IT staff to be able to take care of a problem, as opposed to having to spend cycles on developing and testing a script to do all the things that they needed to do for a config. It's better to have it available to them from a user interface. So if anyone isn't aware of this, obviously it's in preview still, but as you know, and if you've worked with Intune or Azure in general, a lot of things go into preview and they stay in preview for a period of time, but they're actually very functional. They're just put in preview because they're still working on additional functionality or features, and they don't pull it out of preview until they've actually gotten to where they've, you know, banged it against the wall enough to where they feel very comfortable with it. I'm using this in my test environment for a few things, and I've had very good success with these settings applying. So what I would recommend anybody, if you guys do have a valid Intune license, is go out here and look at the configuration profiles, and look at the settings catalog just to see what you can do in here. So for example, obviously I can do filters. So if I want to do a search and I want to do password, it'll tell me, give me all the settings that are related to password. So if I were to want to say, I want to look at security, I can say configure Windows password. It's going to be in here. And I can go ahead and change whatever I want on here. Any questions on device configurations as it relates to settings catalog? All right, I'll take that as a no then. So again,
Quick time check, Ken. There's about 10 minutes left.
Yep. I think I'm going to stop here at the settings catalog because just like I said, the important thing is your configuration of the device after you go through that autopilot provisioning process, because the device isn't truly provisioned, at least in my mind, until all the applications that are required for the device are there and any of the required settings are on the device. So that's where you're going to do your device configuration within devices again. Configuration profiles, and then obviously your applications, and then within Windows apps, and then adding specific applications. I'd like to take the last 10 minutes to allow for questions, comments, eggs to be thrown.
No, you guys were great. You were answering my questions as we were going.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. Sometimes these are a little challenging because as I'm giving them, you start to realize, oh, I want to cover this too. And that's why we're doing the series. Obviously, the series, everything leads into one another. They all bleed into one another. So if you listen to any of the other ones, you might notice that as we're talking about things, we're actually talking about other things that have already built upon what we're talking about today.
It's actually a good segue there. Ken, if you want to pull up the presentation again.
Yep.
So, yeah, our series, we are in our July session here, the Streamlining Device Deployments with Windows Autopilot, but we do have all of the previous sessions recorded, and we have a link there at improvement.com/services/cloud solution provider. So if you wanted to review any of those previous sessions, they are available there. But we do have our upcoming session as we continue to build upon our modern endpoint management strategy. So again, the purpose or the intent of our series this year is to kind of walk through establishing a strong endpoint management strategy and all the different parts and pieces and little details to get that up and running in your environment. So we'll be continuing next month with going into device management. So we all think about device management as managing our mobile devices with iOS and Android, but how do we look at that as managing Windows devices from Intune? So we talked about using Autopilot today for deployment. So now we'll talk about, or next month, we'll talk about managing those Windows 10 devices from the cloud. So hope everyone is going to be in attendance for that one, because I think that'll be pretty interesting. That's an area that I would actually like to learn more on. So I'm looking forward to it. But I do appreciate everyone's time. We'll stay on here for the next few minutes if there aren't any questions. But appreciate everyone's attendance, and I look forward to seeing you next month. Thanks again, Ken. Great job.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you. I look forward to hearing from you guys.
Yeah, we'll definitely reach out to you, Josh.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. So if there are any